Some people laugh at old things because they've forgotten what loyalty looks like. The laughter started with a phone. Not a mistake. Not an insult. Just a phone. A cracked, outdated phone wrapped in a faded blue case that had clearly survived better days. Yet somehow, in one of Manhattan's most expensive restaurants, it became the funniest thing in the room. Grace Sullivan stood quietly beside table 12, balancing a silver tray against her hip while the dinner crowd buzzed around her. Crystal glasses reflected the warm glow of chandeliers overhead. The scent of grilled steak and rosemary drifted through the air. Outside, December rain painted silver streaks across the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Fifth Avenue. Inside, every table seemed occupied by people who measured success in stock prices, luxury watches, and private jets. Grace had learned long ago how to move through rooms like these without drawing attention. At 28, she had mastered the art of being overlooked. Her blonde hair was tied neatly into a simple ponytail. Her black uniform was spotless despite a 10-hour shift. Her smile remained professional, calm, almost invisible. She preferred it that way. Most nights, nobody remembered her name. Tonight would be different. "Excuse me, miss." The voice came from the head of the table. Deep, confident, used to being heard. Grace turned. Ethan Caldwell sat surrounded by business associates. At 39, he looked exactly like the magazines described him. Sharp jawline, perfectly tailored charcoal suit, silver watch worth more than most people's annual salary. Founder of Caldwell Properties. Billionaire. Media favorite. The kind of man who could buy entire city blocks before breakfast. "Yes, sir?" Grace asked. Ethan pointed toward the edge of the table. "I think your museum exhibit is ringing." The group erupted in laughter. For a second, Grace didn't understand. Then she noticed the sound. Her phone. The old phone resting inside her apron pocket. The vibration had triggered the ringtone. She reached down and silenced it immediately. More laughter followed. Ethan leaned back in his chair, clearly pleased with himself. "Seriously, one of the executives said, I haven't seen a phone like that since high school." Another shook his head. "That thing belongs behind glass." The table laughed again. Grace simply nodded. "I apologize for the interruption." Her voice stayed soft, professional, unshaken. Ethan watched her carefully, almost disappointed. Most people reacted when he joked at their expense. They laughed nervously, defended themselves, tried to impress him. Grace did none of those things. She simply stood there, calm as still water. "You know," Ethan said, lifting his wine glass, "I could buy you a new phone right now." More laughter. "Actually," another man added, "he could probably buy everyone in this restaurant a new phone." Grace offered a polite smile. "That's very generous, sir." "But," Ethan asked, "but I'm happy with the one I have." The answer seemed to catch him off guard. A small silence settled across the table. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Happy with that?" Grace looked down briefly at the phone hidden inside her apron pocket. Her fingers brushed against the worn edges of the case. Just for a second. A movement so small nobody noticed. Nobody except Ethan. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. Very happy. Something in her tone felt different. Not defensive. Not embarrassed. Certain. The kind of certainty money couldn't purchase. Ethan studied her face. For the first time, the joke stopped being funny. There was something unusual about the way she protected that old device. Not like someone protecting outdated technology. More like someone protecting a memory. But before he could say anything else, Grace stepped back. "Will there be anything else this evening?" Ethan glanced around the table. "No. I think we're good. Enjoy your dinner." She turned and walked away. The conversation quickly returned to business. New acquisitions. Luxury developments. Market forecasts. $1 million opportunities. Yet Ethan found himself looking toward the dining room. Watching the waitress move between tables. Watching the way she carried herself. Quiet. Efficient. Unbothered. Across the room, Grace paused near the service station. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the old phone. The screen was scratched. The corners worn smooth by time. Most people would have thrown it away years ago. Grace stared at the dark screen for a moment. Then she smiled. Not because of the call. Not because of the message waiting for her. But because the phone reminded her of someone she refused to forget. She slipped it back into her pocket and returned to work. Meanwhile, at table 12, Ethan Caldwell lifted his glass again. He thought he had spent the evening laughing at an old phone. He had no idea he had just laughed at the most important object his family would ever encounter. The dinner rush continued as rain tapped softly against the tall windows overlooking Fifth Avenue. Grace Sullivan moved through the restaurant with the steady rhythm of someone who had learned to carry responsibility without complaint. Table after table, order after order, refill after refill. Most customers never noticed her beyond the moment they needed something. That was fine with her. Attention had never been the goal. Survival had been. At 9:30 that evening, the crowd began to thin. Empty wine glasses disappeared. Conversations softened. The city lights outside shimmered across the wet streets below. Grace stepped into a quiet service hallway and finally allowed herself a moment to breathe. Her feet ached after nearly 11 hours on the floor. Her shoulders felt heavy. Yet the first thing she reached for was not a glass of water. It was the phone. Carefully, almost instinctively, she pulled it from her apron pocket. The screen flickered to life. The wallpaper appeared. A photograph taken years ago. A smiling man standing beside a fishing boat on a lake somewhere in upstate New York. Sunlight reflected off the water behind him. His baseball cap sat crooked on his head. His grin looked effortless. Grace stared at the image for a few seconds longer than usual. "Hi, Dad," she whispered. The words barely left her lips. She opened the latest voicemail notification. The message was from her aunt in Syracuse. Nothing urgent, just a reminder about Sunday dinner. Family, the kind of thing her father had always protected. Grace listened quietly before locking the screen again. The old phone slipped back into her pocket. Some people carried expensive devices filled with stock portfolios, business contacts, and market forecasts. Grace carried memories. Back in the dining room, Ethan Caldwell signed a contract worth nearly $80 million without reading more than the final page. His attorneys had already approved everything. His partners looked pleased. Another successful deal. Another profitable evening. Yet his attention kept drifting. Not toward the paperwork. Toward the waitress. He noticed how customers thanked her by name. He noticed how elderly guests smiled when she stopped to chat for a few seconds. He noticed how she never rushed anyone, even when the restaurant was busy. Most surprisingly, he noticed how she never once looked impressed by wealth. It was unusual. In Ethan's world, people usually reacted to money. They admired it, chased it, measured themselves against it. Grace seemed completely untouched by it. "You are staring again," one of his executives joked. Ethan smirked. "I am observing." The waitress. The phone. More laughter circled the table. "Still thinking about that thing?" another executive asked. Ethan took a sip of coffee. "I just do not understand why someone would keep using it. Maybe she cannot afford a new one." Ethan shook his head. No, the answer came too quickly. "Then what is it?" Ethan looked across the room. Grace was helping an elderly couple gather their coats. Her smile looked genuine, unforced. "I do not know," he admitted. "But people do not protect things like that unless they matter." Across the restaurant, Grace returned to the service station. Her manager handed her a small stack of receipts. "Good work tonight," he said. "Customers keep mentioning you in reviews." Grace smiled politely. "Thank you. You could probably work somewhere much bigger than this place." She laughed softly. "Maybe." The manager walked away. Grace glanced toward the dining room. For a brief moment, her eyes met Ethan Caldwell's. Neither looked away immediately. There was no hostility, no challenge, just curiosity. Then Grace returned to her work. Ethan turned back toward his partners. Yet something about that brief glance stayed with him. He could not explain why. He had spent decades learning how to evaluate assets, properties, investments, and opportunities. He could estimate value faster than most people could calculate a restaurant tip. But tonight, for the first time in a long while, he had encountered something he could not measure. What Ethan did not know was that the worn phone resting inside Grace Sullivan's apron pocket contained more than photographs and voicemails. Hidden among years of memories was a single video file, a forgotten recording that had sat untouched for nearly 15 years. A recording connected to a rainy afternoon, a construction site, a decision that changed two families forever. And before this week was over, that old phone would reveal a truth neither Grace nor Ethan was prepared to face. The restaurant finally closed a little after 11. Chairs were turned upside down on tables. The last guests drifted into the rainy Manhattan night. The soft music that had filled the dining room all evening faded into silence. Grace Sullivan finished wiping down her final table and hung her apron on the hook beside the kitchen door. Another shift completed. Another day closer to paying next month's bills. She gathered her coat and stepped outside. Cold air greeted her immediately. Rain misted across the sidewalks, turning every streetlight into a golden blur. Taxis rolled past in streams of reflected color. Somewhere downtown, a siren echoed faintly before disappearing into the distance. Grace began the familiar walk toward the subway station 3 blocks away. Halfway there, her phone vibrated again. She stopped beneath the awning of a closed bookstore and pulled it from her pocket. The screen illuminated her face. One missed call. Unknown number. That was unusual. Almost nobody called this phone anymore except family. She hesitated before pressing play on the voicemail. A man's voice filled the speaker. Older. Professional. Hello, Grace. This is Robert Jennings. I know it has been a long time. I found something that belonged to your father. I believe you should see it. Please call me when you can. The message ended. Grace stared at the screen. Robert Jennings. She had not heard that name in years. Not since the weeks after her father passed away. Her heartbeat slowed, then quickened again. Robert had worked alongside her father at a construction company outside Albany nearly 15 years earlier. After the funeral, they had spoken a handful of times. Then life had moved on, or at least pretended to. Grace slipped the phone back into her pocket and continued toward the subway. Above her, rain tapped softly against steel and concrete. Below ground, the train platform hummed with late-night commuters heading home. She found an empty seat and leaned against the window. The city rushed by in streaks of light. Her thoughts drifted backward. Back to summers spent fishing with her father. Back to long drives in an aging pickup truck. Back to the sound of his laugh. Some memories faded with time. Others remained untouched. Her phone contained many of them. Across town, Ethan Caldwell sat alone in the back seat of a black sedan. The business dinner was over. The contracts were signed. The executives had gone home. Yet instead of feeling satisfied, he felt distracted. The city skyline passed outside his window while his mind remained somewhere inside that restaurant. Specifically, with a waitress who had refused his assumptions. Ethan opened his phone and checked the news. Then emails. Then market reports. Nothing held his attention. Finally, he locked the screen and stared out at the rain. Everything all right, sir? His driver asked. Fine, Ethan replied. But he was not fine. Curiosity had always been one of his strengths. It had built his fortune. When something did not make sense, he investigated. Tonight did not make sense. A waitress carrying a 15-year-old phone. A calm confidence that ignored status. A look in her eyes whenever she touched that device. Something was missing from the story. Ethan disliked missing pieces. The next morning arrived gray and cold. Grace reported for her shift at 10 o'clock. The lunch crowd had not yet arrived. Sunlight struggled through heavy clouds outside. She was organizing menus behind the host's stand when her phone vibrated again. This time a text message appeared. It was from Robert Jennings. 3 simple sentences. Found an old storage box. There is something inside with your father's name on it. I think it explains what happened that day. Grace froze. Her fingers tightened around the phone. What happened that day? For 15 years, nobody had spoken those words. Nobody. The message continued. There is also a video. Grace felt the air leave her lungs. A video. Her eyes moved slowly to the old phone resting in her hands. Because hidden deep inside its memory was a video too. A recording she had never fully watched. A recording her father had saved only hours before everything changed. And for the first time in 15 years, Grace began to wonder whether the 2 videos were connected. Grace spent the rest of the morning distracted in a way she had not experienced in years. Every time she reached for a menu or poured a cup of coffee, her mind returned to the same message. There is also a video. The words echoed through her thoughts like a distant bell. By noon, the restaurant was busy again. Conversations filled the dining room. Plates moved in and out of the kitchen. The ordinary rhythm of the day continued. Yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. During her lunch break, Grace stepped into the employee lounge and pulled out her phone. The old device felt heavier than usual. She sat alone near a small window overlooking an alley and opened the photo gallery. Thousands of images appeared. Family gatherings, fishing trips, birthday cakes, snow-covered driveways. Years of memories stored inside a device most people considered worthless. Then she opened a folder she rarely touched. The folder had no title, only a date, 15 years earlier. Her finger hovered above a single video file. She had seen pieces of it before, never all of it. The recording began with shaky footage of a construction site somewhere outside Albany. Trucks moved across muddy ground. Workers wore reflective vests and hard hats. A man laughed behind the camera. Her father. Even after all these years, Grace recognized his voice instantly. The sound hit her chest with unexpected force. She watched as the camera panned across steel beams and partially completed structures. Ordinary footage. Nothing unusual. Then the recording ended abruptly after a few minutes. Grace frowned. That was all she remembered. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that explained Robert Jennings' message. Unless there had once been more. Her phone vibrated before she could think further. A customer needed assistance. The break was over. She slipped the phone away and returned to work. Several miles uptown, Ethan Caldwell sat in a glass conference room overlooking Central Park. 12 executives filled the table. Charts covered large digital screens. Discussions focused on quarterly projections and future developments. Normally, Ethan dominated meetings like this. Today, he barely heard half the conversation. "Ethan," one executive asked, "what do you think?" He blinked. "About what?" The room fell silent. That alone was enough to surprise everyone present. Ethan Caldwell forgot nothing. Ever. "The Brooklyn Project," another executive said carefully. Ethan glanced toward the presentation. Approved. The meeting moved forward. Yet his attention drifted again. Eventually, his assistant followed him into the hallway. "You seem distracted." Ethan adjusted his jacket. "Do I?" "You approved a $42 million proposal without asking a single question." That earned a small smile. "Maybe I trust my team. Or maybe something else is on your mind." Ethan did not answer immediately. Finally, he asked, "Have you ever met someone who completely contradicted your first impression?" His assistant laughed. "Several times." Ethan looked out the window. Interesting. That afternoon, while Grace delivered coffee to a table near the windows, a familiar voice stopped her. "Miss Sullivan?" She turned. Ethan Caldwell stood near the entrance. Alone this time. No executives. No lawyers. No audience. Just the billionaire. Grace maintained her professional smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Caldwell. I was in the neighborhood." It was an obvious excuse. Both of them knew it. "Would you like a table?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "If one is available." 20 minutes later, he sat near the windows with a black coffee and nothing else. He seemed less interested in the menu than in observing the room around him. Grace eventually approached with a refill. "Can I get you anything else?" Ethan looked up. "Can I ask you a question?" "Depends on the question." The answer surprised him. Most people never responded that way. "Why do you still use that phone?" Grace glanced toward her apron pocket, then back at him. Her expression remained calm. "Because some things matter more than upgrades." Ethan studied her face. "That sounds like a story." "Maybe. And you are not going to tell it?" Grace smiled softly. "Not today." For a moment, neither spoke. Outside, gray clouds drifted across the city skyline. Finally, Ethan nodded. "Fair enough." Grace turned to leave. But as she walked away, her phone vibrated once more. This time a photograph arrived from Robert Jennings. Grace stopped moving. Her eyes widened. The image showed an old storage box covered in dust. Across the side, written in faded black marker, were 4 words. "Property of Michael Sullivan." Her father's name. For the rest of the afternoon, Grace could not stop thinking about the photograph. "Property of Michael Sullivan." The faded words seemed to burn through the screen of her phone every time she looked at them. She had spent years believing there was nothing left to discover. Her father had passed away when she was 13. The funeral came. The condolences came. Life moved forward because it had to. Whatever answers existed had disappeared with him. At least that was what she had always believed. Now she was no longer sure. The lunch crowd slowly faded into the early evening rush. Outside, the sky darkened over Manhattan. Inside, the restaurant filled once again with conversations and clinking glasses. Grace continued working, but her thoughts remained somewhere else. Every spare moment, she checked her phone, hoping another message would arrive. Shortly after 6 o'clock, it finally did. Robert Jennings had sent an address. Albany, nearly 150 miles north of the city. Along with it came a short message. The box was hidden in storage after the company changed ownership. Nobody knew it was there. "I opened it this morning." Grace stared at the screen. Then another message arrived. "You should come this weekend." A strange feeling settled over her. hope mixed with uncertainty. She slipped the phone back into her apron just as another table signaled for service. Across the dining room, Ethan Caldwell had returned. Once again he sat alone. The same table near the windows. The same black coffee. The same thoughtful expression. Grace noticed him immediately. This time she was not surprised. Something told her his visit had little to do with food. As she approached, Ethan glanced up from a stack of documents. "Busy day?" he asked. "They usually are. You seem distracted." Grace almost laughed. That is an interesting observation coming from someone who keeps returning to a restaurant just to drink coffee. Ethan smiled. "Fair point." For a moment neither spoke. Then Ethan tapped the folder beside him. "I spent most of today reviewing property records." "That sounds exciting." "It is not." Grace smiled despite herself. Ethan noticed. It was the first genuine smile he had seen from her. Not the professional one. Not the polite one. A real one. Somehow it changed her entire face. "There it is," he said quietly. Grace frowned. "What?" "The smile." She shook her head and looked away. "Do not read too much into it." "I probably will." Before she could respond, her phone vibrated again. Instinctively she reached for it. Ethan noticed the sudden shift in her expression. The message contained a new photograph. This one showed the contents of the storage box. Old documents, construction reports, several photographs, and something else. A small stack of videotapes. Grace stopped breathing for a second. One tape had a handwritten label attached to the front. June 18th. Caldwell Project. Ethan saw the color leave her face. "Grace." She barely heard him. "Caldwell Project." Her eyes moved back to the photograph, then slowly toward Ethan Caldwell sitting across from her. Caldwell. The same last name. The same family. The same empire. The same name that had appeared on skyscrapers, development signs, and newspaper headlines her entire life. Suddenly the room felt smaller. Quieter. Colder. Ethan noticed the change immediately. "Is everything all right?" Grace looked at him carefully. For the first time, she was not seeing a billionaire customer. She was seeing a connection. A possibility. A thread leading backward 15 years into the past. "Grace," Ethan repeated. She slipped the phone into her pocket. "I am not sure." Ethan studied her expression. Whatever had just happened was important. He could see it in her eyes. But he also recognized something else. A wall. The same wall he had sensed from the beginning. Grace looked toward the windows where city lights reflected across the glass. Somewhere beyond those lights sat an old storage box. Inside it waited answers buried for 15 years. And for the first time, she began to suspect that those answers might be connected not only to her father, but to the man sitting directly in front of her. That night, Grace barely slept. Rain tapped softly against her apartment window while the city hummed beyond the glass. The photograph from Robert Jennings remained open on her phone. She studied it again and again. The storage box, the videotapes, the handwritten label, Caldwell Project. Every road seemed to lead back to the same name. Ethan Caldwell. By sunrise, she had made a decision. She would go to Albany on Saturday. Whatever waited inside that box had waited 15 years. It could wait 3 more days. Friday passed slowly. Every customer seemed to ask more questions than usual. Every hour felt longer. Yet beneath the routine of carrying trays and filling coffee cups, her thoughts remained fixed on the weekend ahead. Shortly after noon, another message arrived from Robert. This time it included a photograph of a newspaper clipping. The paper had yellowed with age. The headline was partially faded, but one phrase remained visible. Local worker praised for quick thinking during construction emergency. Grace stared at the image. Beneath the headline sat a photograph. Grainy, small, yet unmistakable. Her father, Michael Sullivan, younger than she remembered, smiling shyly at the camera. Her chest tightened. She could not remember the last time she had seen a picture of him she did not already own. Beneath the photograph was a short paragraph. Most of the text had become impossible to read after years in storage. Only a few words remained clear. Construction site. Caldwell Development. Employee recognition. Grace read the lines 3 times. Then 4. Something important had happened that day. Something everyone seemed to know except her. Across town, Ethan Caldwell was having a difficult day for an entirely different reason. He sat in his office overlooking Midtown Manhattan while executives presented financial forecasts. Numbers filled screens. Revenue projections climbed steadily upward. By every measurable standard, life was excellent. Yet he found himself distracted again. Finally, after the meeting ended, he called his assistant. Do we have any historical records from early company projects? She looked surprised. How early? 15 years ago. Probably. What? Ethan hesitated. The question sounded ridiculous even to him. Curiosity. Within an hour, several archived reports arrived in his office. Most involved developments completed by his father before Ethan took control of the company. Ethan flipped through them casually at first. Then more carefully. One project caught his attention. A mixed-use development outside Albany. The name appeared at the top of the file. Caldwell Project. Ethan frowned. Something about it sounded familiar. He opened the report. Hundreds of pages. Budgets. Timelines. Contractor records. Nothing unusual. Then a small note near the back caught his attention. Employee recognition event. June 18th. The date matched the label Grace had seen in the photograph. Ethan leaned back slowly. Coincidence was possible, but increasingly unlikely. That evening he returned to the restaurant. This time Grace seemed less surprised to see him. Coffee, she asked. Ethan smiled. You know me too well. She poured the cup and placed it in front of him. Neither spoke for a moment. Finally, Ethan said, Have you ever felt like you were standing near an answer without knowing the question? Grace looked at him carefully. The timing of the remark unsettled her. That is oddly specific. Maybe. He stirred his coffee. I spent all day looking through old company records. Grace froze for the briefest moment. Ethan noticed. Why? She asked. Because I could not stop thinking about something. What? Ethan looked directly at her. You. The answer was honest. Simpler than anything money could buy. Grace lowered her eyes briefly. Then she reached into her apron pocket and touched the old phone. For the first time since this strange chain of events had begun, she realized something important. Whatever truth waited inside that storage box was already moving toward the present. Piece by piece. Clue by clue. And somehow, without either of them understanding why, Ethan Caldwell was becoming part of the story. Saturday arrived beneath a pale winter sky. Grace left Manhattan before sunrise. The train north rolled through miles of frozen fields and quiet towns while she sat beside the window with the old phone resting in her lap. Every few minutes her eyes drifted toward the screen, toward the photograph of her father, toward the unanswered questions waiting in Albany. 3 hours later she stepped onto the platform and found Robert Jennings waiting beside a weathered pickup truck. Time had added gray to his hair and lines to his face, but Grace recognized him immediately. For a moment neither spoke. Then Robert smiled softly. You look just like him. Grace felt her throat tighten. It has been a long time. Robert nodded. Too long. They drove through quiet streets until they reached an aging warehouse on the edge of town. The building had once belonged to a construction company. Most of it now sat empty. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight as Robert unlocked a side door and led her inside. The storage box waited on a folding table near the back wall. It looked ordinary. Cardboard. Faded. Slightly crushed at one corner. Yet Grace could not stop staring at it. 15 years of silence seemed to rest inside that box. Robert stepped back. I thought you should be the one to open it. Grace slowly lifted the lid. The smell of old paper drifted into the air. Photographs lay stacked beside notebooks and company reports. Several videotapes sat near the bottom. Everything looked untouched, preserved by accident, or perhaps by fate. She carefully picked up one photograph. Her father stood beside a group of workers wearing construction helmets. Everyone was smiling. Another showed him shaking hands with an older man in a business suit. Grace turned the picture over. Written on the back were 4 words. Richard Caldwell. Project completion event. Grace froze. Richard Caldwell. Ethan's father. Suddenly the connection felt real. No longer a theory. No longer coincidence. Robert noticed the photograph. Your father respected Richard Caldwell. They knew each other? Grace asked. More than most people realized. Robert walked toward the table and picked up a thin folder. There is something else. He opened it carefully. Inside sat several employee commendations. One carried Michael Sullivan's name. Another included a letter signed personally by Richard Caldwell. Grace read the first lines aloud. In recognition of exceptional character and dedication. Her hands trembled slightly. She had never seen any of this before. Why did nobody tell me? Robert looked away for a moment. Because after your father passed away, the company changed ownership. Records disappeared. People moved on. Some stories got left behind. Grace lowered her eyes. Some stories got left behind. The sentence felt painfully true. Then she noticed something else near the bottom of the box. A small digital memory card sealed inside a plastic sleeve. Robert smiled when he saw it. That is what caught my attention. Grace picked it up. What is it? We found it hidden inside one of the videotape cases. And Robert hesitated. I had it converted yesterday. He reached into his coat pocket and handed her a flash drive. The full video is on there. Grace stared at it. The room suddenly felt very quiet. I thought the recording on my phone was complete. Robert slowly shook his head. It was not. What do you mean? Robert took a deep breath. The file on your phone ends early. This one does not. Grace felt her heartbeat quicken. What is on it? Robert looked directly at her. I think it explains why Richard Caldwell spent years trying to find your father. The words landed like a stone in still water. Grace blinked. Trying to find him. After that day at the construction site. Robert nodded slowly. He searched for months. Grace stared at the flash drive resting in her palm. Outside, winter wind brushed softly against the warehouse walls. Somewhere far away, Ethan Caldwell was beginning another ordinary Saturday. He had no idea that less than 150 miles away, a forgotten piece of his family's history had just resurfaced. And inside a dusty warehouse, Grace Sullivan finally held the missing chapter everyone else seemed to know except her. Grace waited until she returned to her apartment before opening the file. Outside, evening settled across Manhattan in a haze of distant lights and drifting clouds. Inside, her small living room felt unusually quiet. The old phone rested beside her laptop on the coffee table. Two devices. Two versions of the same story. One incomplete. One finally ready to be heard. She inserted the flash drive and clicked play. For several seconds, the screen showed the same footage she already knew. The construction site. Workers moving between equipment. Her father laughing behind the camera. The familiar images brought an immediate ache to her chest. Then something changed. The recording continued. Grace leaned forward. This part had never existed on the version stored inside her phone. The camera shifted toward a newly completed section of the development. Several executives were visiting the site that afternoon. Among them stood Richard Caldwell. Younger, confident, proud of the project carrying his family name. The video quality was imperfect, but the faces were clear enough. Grace watched her father approach the group. One of the executives shook his hand. Another thanked him for solving a problem that had delayed construction earlier that week. Michael Sullivan smiled awkwardly and tried to avoid attention. That felt familiar. Even through old footage, her father looked exactly the way she remembered him. Humble, quiet, more comfortable helping than being recognized. The recording continued. Workers moved around the site. Conversations drifted in and out of earshot. Then something unexpected happened. Richard Caldwell stepped directly in front of the camera. Mike, he called. Come here for a second. Grace froze. Her father lowered the camera and walked toward him. The video angle shifted downward, but the audio remained clear. I never thanked you properly, Richard said. You helped us avoid a very serious problem this month. Michael laughed softly. I was just doing my job. No, Richard shook his head. You were looking out for people. There is a difference. Several others nodded in agreement. Then Richard handed him an envelope. Michael immediately tried to refuse it. Even through the recording, Grace could hear the embarrassment in her father's voice. That is not necessary. Take it, Richard insisted. You earned it. Grace watched in silence. Tears slowly gathered in her eyes. Not because of the envelope. Not because of the recognition. Because she had almost forgotten the sound of her father's voice. Then the footage moved forward again. Nearly 40 more minutes of ordinary moments followed. Workers joking. Equipment moving. Conversations about schedules and deadlines. Nothing dramatic. Nothing extraordinary. Just people building something together. Yet near the end of the recording, the camera settled briefly on a conversation between Richard Caldwell and another executive. Where is Sullivan? The executive asked. Richard smiled. Probably helping somebody. The answer came without hesitation. Without thought. As if everyone already knew it was true. Grace paused the video. Her apartment suddenly felt too small for the emotions filling it. For years, she had carried questions. Questions about why her father mattered to people she had never met. Questions about why Richard Caldwell searched for him afterward. Questions about what had been lost. The answers were beginning to emerge. Not through grand revelations. through small moments, through respect, through kindness remembered long after profit margins and contracts had been forgotten. Then she noticed something else. At the very end of the file sat a final segment, only 3 minutes long, separate from the rest of the footage. Added later. Grace pressed play again. The screen flickered. A different setting appeared. Office. Richard Caldwell sat alone behind a desk. The date stamp showed 2 weeks after the original recording. His expression looked tired, thoughtful, serious. He stared directly into the camera. If anyone ever finds this recording, he began quietly, there is something they should know about Michael Sullivan. Grace stopped breathing. The room seemed to fall completely silent. Outside, traffic continued below her apartment window. Somewhere across the city, Ethan Caldwell was finishing dinner with friends, completely unaware that a message recorded by his father 15 years earlier was about to change everything both families believed about the past. Grace stared at the screen as Richard Caldwell's recorded image remained motionless for a moment. The older man looked different from the confident executive she had seen earlier in the footage. There was a weight behind his eyes now, a seriousness that came from carrying something important for too long. Then he spoke. Most people will remember buildings, contracts, profits. That is how business works. But if this recording survives, I hope someone remembers the man who taught me that character matters more than any of those things. Grace felt tears forming before she even understood why. Richard continued. 15 years ago, Michael Sullivan saved this company from making a mistake that would have hurt a great many people. He did not do it because it benefited him. He did not do it for recognition. He did it because he believed it was the right thing to do. The room around Grace disappeared. Only the screen remained. Only the voice. I offered him promotions, bonuses, opportunities. Every time he politely declined. He said the same thing. Richard smiled sadly. He told me that success meant being able to look his daughter in the eye at the end of the day. Grace covered her mouth. Her father had been talking about her. All those years ago. Richard lowered his gaze briefly before continuing. If you are watching this, there is something else you deserve to know. The future of several Caldwell projects was protected because Michael Sullivan spoke up when others stayed silent. The company owes him more than it can ever repay. Grace felt her heart pounding. The recording was not revealing a hidden scandal. It was revealing something far more powerful. Respect, gratitude, truth. Richard leaned closer toward the camera. I spent months trying to find him afterward because I wanted to thank him properly. By the time I learned what had happened, it was too late. His voice softened. I never got the chance. Silence followed. Then Richard looked directly into the camera one final time. If Michael Sullivan's family ever sees this recording, I want them to know something. The Caldwell family remembers. We always will. The screen faded to black. Grace sat motionless. The apartment remained quiet except for the distant sounds of traffic beyond the window. For years she had carried the old phone because it was the last thing her father had touched. The last piece of him she could hold in her hands. She never imagined it also contained the first step toward understanding who he truly was. The next afternoon she returned to work. Manhattan moved at its usual pace. People hurried along sidewalks. Taxis filled the streets. Life continued as if nothing had changed. Yet everything had changed for Grace. Near sunset, Ethan Caldwell entered the restaurant again. The moment he saw her, he sensed something was different. Not sadness, not worry. Peace. A quiet kind of peace. Grace approached his table carrying a fresh cup of coffee. Ethan looked up. You found something, did you not? She smiled softly. Yes. Was it good news? Grace glanced toward the old phone resting inside her apron pocket. Then back at him. It was the truth. Ethan nodded slowly. Somehow he understood. And was the truth worth finding? Grace looked out the window where the city lights were beginning to appear one by one across the skyline. More than I can explain. For a moment neither spoke. Then Grace reached into her pocket and placed the old phone gently on the table. Ethan looked at the worn case. The scratched screen. The device he had laughed at only days earlier. He remembered every careless joke. Every assumption. Every moment he had judged its value without understanding its purpose. Grace noticed the expression on his face. It is not worth much, she said quietly. Ethan shook his head. I think it might be priceless. Grace smiled. This time there was no wall between them. No mystery. No misunderstanding. Just two people sitting across from each other beneath the warm lights of a Manhattan restaurant. One had spent years searching for answers. The other had spent years measuring value. Both had learned something. Ethan learned that worth cannot be determined by appearances. Grace learned that some stories survive even when people believe they are forgotten. Outside, the city continued to shine against the evening sky. Inside, an old phone rested quietly on the table between them, no longer a symbol of what someone lacked, a reminder of what should never be lost. Because the most valuable things in life are rarely the newest. They are the things that help us remember who we are.